Hello, everyone. Welcome. I am thrilled to be a part of this conference today, and thank you for joining my session. This has been a hot topic in organizations, and what I have been hearing from multiple generations in the workplace are some of their concerns, some of the challenges, and certainly bias and stereotyping that occurs. So in today's session, I'll be unpacking what some of the research tells us, global trends, but also highlighting these three key areas with commentary from the globe and also strategies. What can be done? To begin, a backdrop of these different generations. Now, the silent generation, there's only about 2% of them in the global workplace currently. And we'll talk about the percentages in just a moment. And as many of you will have read articles, there's been a lot of research conducted about generations in the workplace. What we see is there seems to be friction between the older generations, boomers and a little bit of Gen X, with the younger generation, particularly Gen Z. But historically, what we find is that there's always been friction between the generations. I remember my father, who is a boomer, growing up and saying that there was such a disconnect between his generation and his parents, belonging to the silent generation, having lived through the Depression, war. They were more conservative. And my father was in his mid-20s, in the mid-70s, with hair down to his waist, having driven a motorbike. This was a disconnect from his father and certainly my father-in-law. So that we see that there are examples of this. I don't believe it's necessarily new. However, technology is a very big player in some of the differences. And let's talk about this. When we look at values, all of us are influenced by our family of origin, our culture, our background, our history, our learned experiences. And so, yes, our generation plays a part of that. And we have some very broad sweeping statements here in terms of what these generations are famous for. However, Johns Hopkins University, reliable source. And what we see with boomers is, I believe, part of the reason that they are more loyal to their organization and or field, this is the way that they are known, is because they have historically had a little less flexibility. So, for example, a lot of boomers will stay in their field. They may move organizations, but they move less. My generation, which is Gen X, I did my PhD in Cambodia while linked with an Australian university. So therefore, I've had freedom and flexibility, as do the younger generations, to study as an adult, to cross-skill with far more ease than what the older generations have, which means that this conservatism that the boomers are renowned for might not necessarily be linked to their outlook, but more around those opportunities to move in their career. Gen X has grown up as this independent generation. And I remember reading one article saying that Gen X was change resistant. And I thought that's interesting because I've lived in 6 different countries. So I've been called a lot of things in my time. Change resistant is not one of them. And this is also when we start to see these values differ depending on individuals. And I think that's really important to note. But what we do see with the younger generations is they become more tech savvy as they were introduced younger. My brother is a millennial, and I remember him heading off to primary school with his school bag housing a computer, which back then was a very, very big laptop. It was almost the size of his back. So he's weighed down by this computer. But I wasn't introduced to computers until I was in probably late primary school, early high school when we started to have access. So therefore, Gen Z sort of came out of the womb on an iPhone, and they have been almost raised differently because of this technology. And in a lot of the work that I do, I speak to parents these days, and so many of them globally are very concerned about technology. What is my child looking at? The plastic, fantastic world of Instagram filters and self-esteem of my child. Also, bullying and all kinds of inappropriate material. Parents are challenged in a lot of ways to respond for different challenges that essentially my parents were not called to do. So you can see here there are some values that might be different in terms of how we also communicate with each other. But this research was conducted by LinkedIn, and you can see here that in some instances, the values in terms of our priorities for work don't necessarily differ that dramatically. There is a slight difference you can see here between Gen Z and the boomers when it comes to a purposeful mission and also the employee training. But I think this could also be reflective of the stages of their careers. The boomers, when they were in their 20s, might have highly valued employee training more so than now when they are more established in their careers and have already had an enormous amount of training and life experience that they bring to the role. Because I think it's interesting when we look at what about organizational culture? How does that factor in? Well, according to LinkedIn, there's very little difference in terms of how important that is when considering a new job. So what the current research points to is that millennials and older generations, our attitudes and values are not necessarily that dramatically different. Where there has been differences, and this research has been drawn from Gallup that does some fabulous state of the world workplace reports, and they look at global well-being. They have just recently really focused on the ages and the different generations and how it presents in terms of engagement or disengagement in the workplace. But this is also in line with global data around happiness. Many of you will be familiar with the world's happiest country list. The United Nations and Gallup does research every year to identify not necessarily how happy are people, that's not the question that they ask, but life satisfaction. They interview between 1,000 and 3,000 people in participating countries. They also look towards country GDP, political stability, lots of different key criteria. But what they've found is there is a huge difference in happiness when you look at the boomers in comparison to Gen Z. So this drops in engagement levels, but it also drops considerably in happiness levels overall. And when we look at the world in which, so by 2030, over 70% of the world's workplace will be comprised. So Gen X and millennials, as the boomers retire, are going to be the dominant, but then that will change within a decade as Gen Z becomes more prominent in the workplace and baby boomers tend to retire as well. What's interesting in the research from the boomers is they're not necessarily retiring in the way that the silent generation did, where there was a definitive finish to work. One resigned and, well, retired, I should say, and went off, played some golf, looked after the grandkids. Many boomers are coming back as consultants. I asked a group of senior engineers recently, what are you planning on doing in your retirement? And they said they were going to be on boards, panels, committees, and these are very senior people in their careers. And I think it's captured beautifully by the words of one of my old clients who is a boomer. He said to me at one point, I've amassed enough money to retire for 3 lifetimes, but I keep coming back as a consultant because I want to stay relevant, was the term that he used. And I really like that because I think that's true of the boomers. And we're seeing this in the makeup of the workplace. So let's look at some of the preconceptions that occur within the generations. And just to give you some further examples and add to what's on this slide. Talking to leadership teams around the world about the younger generation, I hear a lot of entitlement. That is the number one word that comes up so much when they're referring to the younger generation. I have also been asked questions in mental health sessions of leadership discussions that I've hosted, and they've said questions such as, Zoe, do you have any specific strategies for Gen Z because they're a sensitive bunch? And another leader said, yes, I agree. They're just not as resilient as the older generation. And one may argue that this is captured in the data when 85% of Gen Zs would like mental health days. So sometimes boomers are not necessarily as open to mental health. And certainly supporting mental health in the workplace has been, I would argue, a relatively new phenomena. 10, 15 years, and certainly in the context of the pandemic, the focus has been strengthened in this area. But also the expression, okay, boomer, has been leveled at multiple people that I've heard from that say it's obnoxious. Particularly a Gen X might be expressing something in a meeting and gets referred to as a boomer as an insult. And also the younger generation being told things such as, you would own your own property right now if you didn't eat so much avocado on toast, was a comment that I heard as well. And so we see these snide remarks being perhaps made in workplaces, and even if they're not being made out loud, how do you think about the different generations? How do you think about the individuals that you're working with in your teams? Do you sometimes have that thought process of the reason they don't understand this is because it's their age? Or we might think that person is inexperienced because they are only this old. And what I've heard from some younger Gen Zs is that they don't get taken seriously, or their ideas are dismissed as a direct result of their age rather than the idea that they're putting forward. And I hear from the older generation, and I remember hearing from a group of Gen Xers in a Fortune 500 tech company that they were dismissed by the younger generation as not being as tech savvy, even though they're quite literally in the field and have had a lot of experience. So these myths and preconceived notions do not help establish strong relationships between the generations in the workplace. So let's now look at some of the similarities, because further research talks, and this part talked about work-life balance as being a top factor. And this is incredibly important. And I've seen this focus certainly in the last few years. And I like to believe it's the millennials and the younger generation that are really pushing back on the way in which we've worked. We've seen that remote and hybrid work options are now sort of here to stay. That being said, a lot of organisations are rolling back complete remote work options and are expecting people to come into the workplace. But the more that we look at global wellbeing programs that organisations are putting in place, they might have yoga in the workplace, they might have really interesting health apps where people can do everything from have a personal training session online to record their nutritional data. And there is a big focus on social relationships as well, and how important that is to the well-being in the workplace. And I think what's really important here is those social connections. When someone is just working and they don't have time, or they forego time with loved ones, how much are they going to be able to keep up the pace, that level of commitment? Because stress, burnout, anxiety, and mental health issues are also a very big part of the landscape currently. So what can help? If social connections are really important, it's not just our personal social connections. It is how we want to be. Some of you might be familiar with the term minority stress. We often see this term attached to LGBTQI plus communities. We also see this for cultural and ethnic minorities in countries. But minority stress is actually a form of trauma because someone might be rejected from their family of origin, their community, and in some instances, their wider country. And this can be particularly damaging on someone's overall level of well-being. And when someone experiences a othering of sorts, it is very similar to minority stress. I was working with a client here in Mauritius, and she is a foreigner. She's lived here for a long time. She's been with her organisation for a long time. And she has been with a new team for only about a year and a half. And this team is much younger than her. And because she's more senior, she has more remote work options and her salary reflects her role. So she feels it's because of those differences that people haven't really accepted her. And she's a really bubbly and vivacious, communicative person. And she's felt very rejected, as she puts it. She hears that they go out for coffee with each other and she doesn't get invited. And she's actually used all of her sick leave and is considering leaving the country because it's had such a dramatic effect on her. So when we reach out with kindness to others in the workplace, irrespective of background and differences, and we try to look for what unifies us, this can be a resilience factor. When someone is experiencing conflict at home but comes into work and they feel connected, like they belong, they're part of a team, this can actually be a very good buffer for the stress that they are experiencing in their social relationships. Furthermore, humans are more likely to gravitate towards positive reinforcement. For my parents that are listening to this, if your child is screaming or carrying on for lollies or candy in the supermarket, do you give your child lollies? Hopefully not, because that's going to reinforce the behavior you don't want to see. This is not something we grow out of. When we're looking at bad behavior in the workplace, it's often because someone has learned, when I do this, I get what I want. So we want to be really careful not to ever reward bad behavior, but instead turn up the volume on positive reinforcement for good behavior, essentially. So when we feel appreciated, when we feel seen, when we feel heard by our colleagues, by our manager, this makes us feel good. It increases dopamine levels in the brain, and dopamine is a neurochemical linked to our reward system that compels us to do something more. So we're essentially reinforcing that behavior that we want to see in a workplace setting. And that value, it is supposed to be more important to the millennials, but I think it's important for a lot of us. If you have a sense of purpose attached to your work, if you can go to work and feel part of a team, that you are contributing to something bigger than you, this, according to Martin Seligman, one of my favorite researchers and the founding father of positive psychology principles, really brings about that sense of well-being through meaningful work. And that's not generation specific. So let's talk now about some of the times when it doesn't work so well. What are some of the challenges in a multi-generational workplace? Communication. And this can be further exacerbated by culture, gender, personality types, and other contributing factors. It's not that all Gen Xers or all boomers communicate in a particular way. This is not true. However, there can be differences in these areas. When we have challenges, we might feel unsafe, and this breaks down trust in the workplace, which is critical for both morale and productivity. When we have differences in our ideas of how fast we are going to progress in our career, when we have differences in perception of that progression, this can lead to friction. Let's dig into these areas. And so I'd like to ask the group to consider the following 3 statements. In your workplace right now, do you feel like you can make mistakes at work, learn and grow from them? Do you feel you can say to someone, I don't know the answer, let me get back to you? Do you feel like you can share your ideas freely? If you answered yes to those 3 areas, this denotes an element of psychological safety. And this is key for trust. I subscribe to the Harvard Business Review, so I'm always reading articles on high trust teams and high performing teams. And in one article, that psychological safety made teams 106% more efficient and effective. And it makes me smile because trust is key to relationships as a whole. It doesn't mean you need to go to work and tell your colleagues your deepest, darkest secrets. But if you don't feel safe in the workplace, this is going to have a really big impact, potentially on your performance and also how you feel about being there. So let's say there are snide remarks being made about different generations, and it's not directed to you, but you're bearing witness to that. Does that make you feel comfortable about coming to work? Often not. We don't trust people. Now, our expectations also differ depending on other contributing factors. And one of the areas that I see coming up a lot with the older generations when it comes to Gen X is, as one of my friends put it, Gen Z belongs to the trophy generation. They got a trophy for participating. And she said that in her field, which is banking, she said some of them seem to be okay with mediocre work. And I think that that's not necessarily the case for all Gen Z. And these statements can be, one, accurate of her experiences, because that's certainly not reflective of an entire generation, but also those personality types, personal goals, how you were raised. And that's what those societal influences are. So there is a lot on this slide, and it's to be used as a bit of a guide. What is possible? And a lot of this will come down to organizational policy, leadership, top-down structures, and what is plausible, what is not. So flexible work arrangements are all wonderful, but this is going to depend on the workplace. But there's a few areas here that we can look for or look towards in terms of individuals. First of all, we don't want to engage in those broad sweeping statements, biases, and stereotyping of generations. This is not going to help our relationships at all. So staying out of that. Reaching out with kindness and curiosity to different generations and learning. This will not only increase, as it says here, an inclusive environment, but it also promotes open communication. So that's one strategy. Another strategy is about recognizing those differences as strengths. And then this facilitates knowledge transfer. Because when we look at humans as from a strengths-based perspective, not everyone is going to be strong with a lot of technology. Not everyone is going to be good communicators. And when we have teams with differences in their backgrounds and their strengths, this hopefully makes for a really collaborative culture where we can draw upon those strengths. Because I've personally don't want everyone to be like me. That would be boring. So I quite like it when someone gives me a different perspective or a different way of looking at the world. It doesn't necessarily mean I agree with them, and I might have strengths in a different area, but I can look at that and think, right, that could, if we work together, become a strength because of those differences. And I always open questions with IT is I'm going to need you to use small words. Because in this instance, I'm every bit my generation, but I also feel that I'm every bit the therapist that I am. Complex human behavior, yes, definitely good understanding of this. But when it comes to all things IT, not so much. So once again, those strengths and weaknesses are there. Now, perhaps knowledge and awareness for IT for me can come from a younger person. But I think that when we look at this great big long list, consider your space, what you could possibly be thinking about in terms of fostering those relationships, and what could you be talking about?